Okay, so now we're going to discuss the important concepts or key points in Unit 4. The first one is the contractionary policy. During a contractionary policy, the government decides to sell securities or bonds, whatever. They increase the reserve ratio, and they also increase the discount rate. Another name for contractionary policy is tight money, or as I like to call it, T-money. The objective of the contractionary policy is to decrease the money supply and also control inflation that's occurring. And also, at the same, an effect of the contractionary policy is the government reducing its spending. The next key point is expansionary policy. During an expansionary policy, the government buys securities. Also, it lowers its reserve ratio and it lowers its discount rate. Another name for expansionary policy is easy money. An objective of expansionary policy is to increase its money supply, and it makes the bank loans less expensive. Also, in expansionary policy, there's an increase in employment and output. The next key point is the reserve requirement. During the reserve requirement, there's a set minimum percentage at its checkable deposits that the bank must keep on the deposit at the Federal Reserve's bank. And in order to find the reserve requirement, there's an equation that you have to perform where you multiply the reserve ratio by the DD, which is the checkable deposits. The next key concept is the excess reserves. The excess reserves is the actual reserve exceeding its required reserves, and the equation to find excess reserves is the actual reserves subtracted by the required reserves. The next key concept is the checkable deposit. The checkable deposit is any deposit in a commercial bank. The next key concept is the money supply. The money supply is the total value of financial assets in the U.S. economy. An example of money supply is the M1 money, which consists of currency and checkable deposits. Also M3, which consists of the time deposits. The next key point is we're going to talk about the difference between the fiscal policy and the monetary policy. The fiscal policy is controlled by Congress and by the President, while the monetary policy is controlled by individual agencies of the federal government, also known as the Federal Reserves. And the last key concept for Unit 4 is the federal fund rate. The federal fund rate is basically the interest rate that the Fed charges one another on overnight loans. If a bank needs money as fast as possible, they make these loans, and basically these loans are called, the interest on these loans are called the federal fund rate. And that concludes Unit 4. We're going to discuss number 2. Let's read number 2 together. In country A, the required reserve ratio is 10%. Assume that the central bank sells $50 million in government securities on the open market. Let's do part A. Calculate each of the following. Now, we have to calculate the total change in reserves in the banking system. So, since the central bank sells $50 million in government securities, then the total change in the reserves in the banking system will decrease by $50 million. Okay, let's move on to number 2. Okay, let me write 50 million right here real quick. 50 million. Okay. Now, the maximum possible change in the money supply. So, to find the maximum possible change in the money supply, we're going to have to multiply the reserve ratio, which is 10%, by the total change in the reserves, which is $50 million. So, that's 50 million times the 10%, which equals $500 million. Okay, let's move on to part B. Using the correctly labeled graph market, show the impact of the central bank's bond sales on the nominal interest rate. Okay, now we're gonna use this money market graph. On the x-axis, it's the nominal interest, while the y-axis is the quantity of money. The money supply is always vertical, while the money demanded is diagonal. So since the selling of the $50 million in government securities, it's going to decrease, which is going to shift the money supply to the left. So we have to shift it to the left. And there's all the money supply is shifted, so that's MS2. And then the change in the interest rate, this is the initial interest rate right here, I1. So the change in the interest rate is going to increase because the interest rate is going to increase, so this is I2 over here. So this is how the money market graph is going to look after. Okay, moving on to part C, what is the impact of the central bank's bond sale on the equilibrium price level in the short run? Okay, so basically the impact of the central bank's bond sale in the equilibrium short run is a decrease because the interest rate, as we saw in this money market graph, is high and the money supply also decreased.